August 19, 1953, Tehran. Tanks roll through streets thick with smoke and shouting. A prime minister flees his own residence in his pajamas, climbing a garden wall to escape the mob outside his gate. By nightfall, he will be arrested. By morning, the story will already be written for you. A communist sympathizer, toppled to save Iran from the Soviets. That is the version you were taught. It is not the version that happened. Because the men who set this coup in motion were not worried about Karl Marx. They were worried about a balance sheet. A single company, headquartered 6,000 kilometers away in London, was staring down the collapse of the most profitable oil concession on Earth, and the bankers behind it were not going to let a prime minister's signature erase it. This is the story of how the Anglo-Iranian oil company and the financial houses standing behind it engineered the fall of a democracy to protect a number. And that number is going to follow us through every act of this story, because it never stopped being the real reason. Write it down, £700 million. Keep that number in your head. Everything that happens next happens because of it. Rewind 50 years before the tanks, 1901. A wealthy Australian speculator named William Knox D'Arcy pays the Shah of Persia for the exclusive right to search for oil across nearly the entire country. Not a partnership, not a lease. A concession 60 years long, granting a foreign company control over one of the largest untapped oil reserves ever discovered, in exchange for a modest upfront payment and a promised share of future profits that would prove, in practice, to be almost impossible to verify. D'Arcy nearly goes broke before he strikes anything. For 7 years, his engineers dig through Persian desert with almost nothing to show for it, and by 1908, his backers in London are ready to pull the funding entirely. A telegram is already drafted, ordering the drilling crew to abandon the site and ship the equipment home. Then, at Mast Solomon, in the final days before the money runs out, they hit oil. Not a trickle. A gusher that shoots 50 feet into the air and burns for days before it can be capped. Within a few years, D'Arcy's venture becomes the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later renamed Anglo-Iranian. And in 1914, on the eve of the First World War, the British government itself buys a controlling stake, 51%, through an Act of Parliament rushed through in a single session. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, pushes the deal through personally, arguing before Parliament that naval supremacy now depends on it. The Royal Navy is converting its entire fleet from coal to oil, and Britain needs a guaranteed, cheap, controllable supply that no rival power can threaten or interrupt. From that moment on, Anglo-Iranian Oil is not just a company. It is an arm of British state power, financed through the Bank of England's networks, insured through the Admiralty's strategic interest, and protected by the Foreign Office as if it were sovereign territory rather than a foreign business operating on someone else's land. For the next 4 decades, the arrangement is simple, and it is lopsided. Iran receives a royalty, a fraction of the profits, calculated using a formula the company itself controls, and Iran has no independent power to audit. Britain receives the rest, along with full control over production, pricing, refining, and the company's books. Iranian workers labor in the fields and the refinery at Abadan, the largest oil refinery in the world at the time, while housing, wages, hospitals, and even drinking fountains are segregated by nationality. British staff live in manicured neighborhoods with tennis courts, cinemas, and swimming pools. Iranian laborers live in mud brick housing without running water, a few hundred meters away, in a country that is, on paper, the sole owner of everything being pumped out of the ground beneath them. By the late 1940s, the company's profits are staggering. In a single year, Anglo-Iranian pays the British government more in taxes than it pays Iran in royalties for the oil itself. Read that again. The country that owns the ground beneath the oil receives less than the treasury of a foreign nation receives, simply for taxing the company that extracts it. Iranian officials request the company's financial records to verify the royalty calculations. They are refused repeatedly on the grounds that the figures are a private commercial matter. This is not sustainable. And in Tehran, a growing coalition of nationalists, clerics, and reform-minded politicians know it. Enter Mohammad Mossadegh, a European-educated aristocrat, a lawyer trained in Switzerland, and by every account a fierce constitutionalist who distrusted concentrated power of any kind, foreign or domestic, monarchic or communist. Frail, prone to fainting during fiery parliamentary speeches, occasionally addressing the nation from his bed in pajamas during moments of political crisis, a habit British newspapers will later mock mercilessly, and one that adds an unintentional irony to the pajama-clad flight that opens this story. He is not a communist. He He does not want Iran aligned with Moscow. His own writings and speeches are full of warnings about the Tudeh party's ambitions, and he spends much of his career maneuvering against Soviet influence as carefully as he maneuvers against British influence. What he wants is something far more threatening to London. He wants Iran to control its own resources, on Iran's own terms, answerable to Iran's own parliament. Mossadegh has been building toward this moment for decades, first as a young provincial governor clashing with corrupt tax farmers, then as a senator who refused a Soviet oil concession in the north on the exact same nationalist principle he now applies to the British concession in the south. To him, oil sovereignty is not an ideological position. It is the logical conclusion of a lifetime spent fighting foreign interference in Iranian governance, regardless of which foreign power is doing the interfering. In March 1951, the Iranian parliament votes unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. Mossadegh becomes prime minister weeks later, tasked with carrying it out. The concession that has generated colossal wealth for British shareholders for half a century is now, by Iranian law. Streets in Tehran fill with celebration. Newspapers across the country run the news for days. For the first time in living memory, ordinary Iranians believe the oil beneath their soil finally belongs to them, and Mossadegh becomes, almost overnight, the most popular political figure Iran has ever produced. London's response is not diplomatic, it is financial warfare. The Anglo-Iranian oil company withdraws every foreign technician overnight, crippling the Abadan refinery's ability to function, since decades of deliberate policy had ensured almost no Iranians were trained to operate the plant's most technical systems. Britain organizes a global boycott, pressuring oil tankers, insurers, and buyers not to touch a single barrel of nationalized Iranian crude, on the threat of legal action anywhere in the British Commonwealth. Lloyd's of London quietly refuses to insure any vessel carrying Iranian oil. The Bank of England freezes Iranian sterling balances, reserves Iran had accumulated in British banks over decades of trade, cutting off Tehran's access to its own money. British warships patrol the Persian Gulf, ostensibly to protect shipping, while actually deterring any buyer bold enough to test the boycott. This is the part they don't teach you. The sanctions campaign against Iran in 1951 was not built by generals. It was built by bankers and oil executives, coordinating quietly through the Foreign Office, the Bank of England, and Anglo-Iranian's own board, men whose fortunes were staked directly to that £700 million valuation we asked you to remember. Mossadegh does not fold. He takes Britain to the International Court of Justice and wins, the court ruling it has no jurisdiction over what is, legally, an internal Iranian matter. He takes the case to the United Nations Security Council and holds his ground there too, personally traveling to New York to argue Iran's position before the world's cameras, drawing sympathetic headlines across much of the non-aligned world. Legally, Iran is untouchable. Financially, Britain is bleeding it dry regardless. Iran's oil exports collapse by more than 90% within a year, foreign currency reserves evaporate, and the national treasury begins to buckle under a crisis engineered 8,000 kilometers away by men Mossadegh has never met and never will. By 1952, the company's own directors are meeting quietly with intelligence officials, not about oil fields, about regime change. Britain cannot topple Mossadegh alone. Its own war debts have left it financially exhausted, its empire already shrinking on every continent from India to Egypt, and its covert operations budget a fraction of what it once was. So British intelligence does something remarkable. It goes shopping for a partner with deeper pockets. At first, Washington is unmoved. President Truman's administration views the crisis largely as a colonial dispute, an aging empire refusing to accept the end of its resource monopoly, and privately urges London to simply renegotiate more fairly with Iran, along the lines of the 50-50 profit-sharing deal American companies had already struck with Saudi Arabia. That's the inconvenient truth buried in most retellings. For nearly 2 years, the United States government sided, at least rhetorically, with the idea that Iran had a legitimate right to its own oil. Then two things change. Truman leaves office, and Eisenhower enters with a new Secretary of State and a new CIA director, brothers named John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles, both of whom had spent their pre-government careers as corporate lawyers at the same New York firm, representing precisely the kind of multinational concessions Anglo-Iranian represented. Their old firm had negotiated oil and mineral concessions across the globe on behalf of Western capital, from Latin America to the Middle East, and both brothers had personally worked cases defending foreign concession rights against nationalist governments. They did not see Mossadegh as a nationalist reformer. They saw him as a precedent, a dangerous one, that could spread from Iran's oil fields to the Suez Canal, to the copper mines of Chile, to every concession-holding company with a foothold in the developing world. British intelligence reframes its pitch accordingly. Forget the oil dispute. That argument had already failed once in Washington. Sell it instead as a Cold War emergency. Warn that if Mossadegh falls to instability or economic collapse, the Iranian Communist Party, the Tudeh Party, could seize the vacuum, and Iran could tip into the Soviet orbit, right on the doorstep of the oil-rich Gulf, with Soviet troops already stationed just across Iran's northern border. It works. In 1953, the CIA and Britain's Secret Intelligence Service jointly authorize a covert operation to remove Mossadegh from power. The Americans codename it Operation Ajax. The plan runs through payments to street organizers, newspaper editors, clergy sympathetic to the monarchy, and military officers, funded quietly, deniably, and largely in cash, funneled through intermediaries who could never be traced back to an embassy. CIA operative Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, personally coordinates the ground operation from inside Iran, working with local agents to organize the paid demonstrations that will follow. It wasn't about communism. It was about a balance sheet. It wasn't about democracy. It was about a balance sheet. It was never about the Cold War at all. It was about £700 million, and who was going to keep collecting it. The first attempt, in mid-August 1953, misfires badly. The Shah, who has reluctantly signed off on Mossadegh's dismissal, loses his nerve when the plan becomes public and flees the country entirely, first to Baghdad and then to Rome, reportedly telling his wife he doubted the plan would work at all. For a moment, it looks as though the operation has collapsed, and that Mossadegh, still wildly popular in the streets, has survived his enemies once again. Celebrations briefly break out in Tehran, with crowds tearing down statues of the Shah, believing the monarchy itself is finished, but the money keeps flowing. Paid crowds, organized through intermediaries with deep ties to the bizarre merchant class and to sympathetic military officers, flood into the streets over the following days, in scenes carefully engineered to look spontaneous. Some are genuine royalists. Many are simply paid, day laborers and strongmen recruited for cash with no ideological stake at all, reportedly earning more in a single day's work than a week's ordinary wage. Tanks loyal to the Shah surround Mossadegh's residence. By August 19th, the very scene we opened on, the Prime Minister is fleeing over his own garden wall, a man who had defeated the British Empire in international court, now unable to defend his own front gate. Within days, the Shah returns from exile, now permanently and visibly dependent on the very foreign powers that restored him to his throne. Mossadegh is arrested, tried for treason before a military tribunal, and eventually sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life, living out his final years quietly, under guard, in a village outside Tehran, largely cut off from the political life he had once dominated. And here is where the story returns precisely to that number we asked you to hold on to. Because Anglo-Iranian oil never gets its old monopoly back outright, the political cost is too visible, even for 1954, even with a friendly Shah back on the throne. Instead, a new consortium is formed, quietly negotiated over months by lawyers representing every interested party. British Petroleum, as Anglo-Iranian will soon rename itself, retains a substantial share of the new arrangement, roughly 40%, a steep discount from its former total control, but still the largest single stake at the table. But now, for the first time, American oil majors, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California, Texaco, Gulf, and Mobil, are cut into the concession as well, splitting another 40% among themselves. The very companies whose lawyers had shaped the Eisenhower administration's Cold War framing of the crisis now hold a direct financial stake in the oil beneath Iranian soil. The £700 million asset didn't disappear. It was never at risk of disappearing at all. It was simply redistributed among the financiers and corporations who had backed the operation to protect it. In the decades that follow, official histories settle into the shape most people know: a Cold War containment story, a necessary evil in the fight against Soviet expansion, filed away alongside a dozen other Eisenhower-era interventions in Guatemala, in the Congo, in Chile, each one, curiously, also involving a foreign company's balance sheet. But look at where the money actually landed. Iran received a reformed royalty structure, better than before on paper, moving to something closer to the 50-50 split Truman's administration had originally proposed, but still without any real Iranian control over production decisions, pricing, or output levels, all of which remained firmly in the consortium's hands. British Petroleum retained roughly 40% of the new concession, preserving its position as the single largest shareholder in what had once been its private empire. The American oil majors split a further 40% among themselves, cementing Gulf oil politics for a generation and giving Washington its own direct financial stake in propping up the Shah's regime for the next 25 years. French and Dutch interests took a smaller remaining share. The royalties that did flow to Iran trickled back to a monarchy now permanently indebted, politically and financially, to the powers that had installed it, a debt that would come due, with interest 26 years later. The coup did not end colonial extraction. It globalized it, spreading the £700 million prize across a wider circle of financiers and governments, while removing the one Iranian leader who had dared to interrupt the flow, and replacing him with a monarch who would spend the next quarter century arming his own secret police against exactly the kind of popular movement that had once carried Mossadegh to power. And a quarter century later, in 1979, when the Shah is overthrown for good and the Islamic Republic rises in his place, the anger that fuels that revolution traces directly back to 1953, to a democratically elected government destroyed not for ideology, but for a number on a company's books. The hostage crisis that follows, the decades of hostility between Washington and Tehran that still shape headlines today, all of it has roots in a boardroom decision most Americans have never heard of, made by men protecting an asset most Americans could never have named. It wasn't about communism. It was about a balance sheet. It wasn't about democracy. It was about a balance sheet. And it still isn't, whenever you hear a resource conflict explained to you as a simple clash of ideas. So here's the question worth sitting with. How many other Cold War ideological conflicts, the ones still taught in classrooms as battles of democracy versus communism, were actually settled long before any soldier arrived, settled quietly, in a boardroom, over a number nobody wanted the public to see?